Some years ago, Mrs. Ada used to work for a beautiful woman named Mrs. Chinelo as a housekeeper. She worked for Mrs. Chinelo for 6 years, and after 6 years, she died. It happened one beautiful morning when Mrs. Chinelo went to Mrs. Ada's room to tell her something. But when she got there, she got shocked at her sight. She found Mrs. Ada on the floor, and after some time, she confirmed that she was dead. So she called the cops and explained everything to them, and they took the body away to bury it after many investigations. 6 months later, Cynthia, who is known to be Mrs. Ada's only child, applied to work for Mrs. Chinelo as a nanny in her home. She claimed she was good with kids, so Mrs. Chinelo welcomed her and employed her. Ada was a young girl at age 17. She worked for Mrs. Chinelo with intentions to avenge her mother's death. She assumed Mrs. Chinelo was behind her mother's death, so she made up her mind that she was going to revenge. While Mrs. Chinelo, on the other hand, was less aware of whom she had employed. She never knew she employed Mrs. Ada's daughter because she never got to see her once, and Cynthia never mentioned anything about her mother. So she only thought she had brought in someone whom she would trust with her kids when she's away. Mrs. Chinelo loved Cynthia and was willing to do anything for her. But each time she offers to do something for Cynthia, Cynthia would decline it, saying she's fine. Cynthia was full of outrage. She had thought of many things she could do to Mrs. Chinelo to bring her down, but she was always short of ideas. Until one day, she waited for Mrs. Chinelo to go out, and as soon as she drove out of the house, she went to one of Mrs. Chinelo's children's room to feed her last son, who was 2 years old, after adding some poison to his food. She added a poison that would kill him slowly, but unfortunately for her, the child refused to eat. She tried to coax him, but instead, he waved the food off, and she got angry. And just when she wanted to hit him, his older sister walked in. She was 7 years old and was talkative, so Cynthia immediately cleaned the room and walked out. 3 months later, Cynthia came up with a plan. She got tired of seeing Mrs. Chinelo alive with her 3 kids while her mother was dead. So she poisoned Mrs. Chinelo's juice, which she requested. After she poisoned it, she went to the dining to give it to Mrs. Chinelo, and immediately she dropped it. Mrs. Chinelo's daughter requested for another one. So she poured the juice into another cup, which was already in the dining. When she left, she was smiling. So she went to her room, leaving Mrs. Chinelo and her daughter in the dining table, talking and laughing. And just while they were chatting, Ina, who was Mrs. Chinelo's daughter, said she needed to sleep after taking a sip of her juice, so she left. And Mrs. Chinelo, who didn't like wasting food, drank the remaining one and got full. So she called Cynthia and told her she was full and that Cynthia could have the second glass. On the other hand, Cynthia, who thought it wasn't poisoned, drank it all. Then she went to the kitchen smiling, waiting patiently for Mrs. Chinelo to collapse and die. But unfortunately for her, a few minutes later, she fell to the ground. Turns out the one she drank was the poisoned one, and then she began to vomit. And out of few seconds, she was out of air. She died a silent death, and no one was aware she was already lying dead in the kitchen until Mrs. Chinelo angrily walked to the kitchen after trying to call Cynthia several times without a response. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed when she saw Cynthia's body on the floor, and immediately she rushed her to the hospital. While they were at the hospital, she prayed fervently for Cynthia to regain consciousness, but as soon as the doctor walked to her, he told her what was contrary to what she hoped for. "She is dead," the doctor said. Then he explained to her that Cynthia took something poisonous which affected both her kidneys. "I'm sorry, madam," he said, but Mrs. Chinelo wasn't satisfied. She wondered how Cynthia ate a poisonous food when she was sure she didn't have any. "Doctor, please explain better," she cried out. After explaining to the doctor that it couldn't have been possible, then the doctor told her he got to find out that the last thing she drank was a juice that contained poison. Who could have poisoned the juice? He asked Mrs. Chinelo, who was still confused until she flashed back and remembered how the juice initially was served to her. But she gave it to Cynthia because she was full, so she explained it to the doctor. "Are you saying she poisoned your juice?" he asked Mrs. Chinelo, who still wasn't sure of what to think until it dawned on her that it could be true. So immediately, she drove home and searched Cynthia's closet, where she found a lot of deadly chemicals and powders. Then she saw a small bottle which had a bold handwriting, "Poison," on it, and she got shocked and cried after realizing that she only brought a murderer to her home. That day, she cried to God and thanked Him for saving her and her family all the while. At night, God showed her a vision and revealed to her why Cynthia intended to kill her, but He saved her because she was innocent. The next day, when she woke up, she prayed with her children and thanked God.